IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi and I have with me my colleague Aditya Ramanathan, and we're going to discuss about moon. So moon is quite exciting. Apart from the fact that India has committed that it would land an Indian on the moon by 2040, there's also developments all across the world regarding moon. There are changes in terms of the treaties that are being uh, negotiated, or discussions regarding what would the moon you know l- lunar governance look like. Now, as the moon gets as crowded as earth, everyone trying to go there, how would that change? Like, what are the current mechanisms, legal treaties, and obligations that nations have regarding moon, and then what can we look forward to? So a very warm welcome, Aditya.
Thanks, Saurabh. Thank you. I'd like to talk about the moon and specifically what we call lunar governance. Just using the words lunar governance makes people smirk because we are on Church Street in Bangalore and we'd like more Church Street governance. But so lunar governance, basically why it's important. I think you've touched upon this, is that the moon is likely to get more crowded over the next 20 years. So like you said, India wants to put an Indian national on the moon by 2040. But even before that, so India's had Chandrayaan 1, Chandrayaan 2, Chandrayaan 3. Other countries have their own missions. So, for example, now NASA is organizing this program called Commercial Lunar Payload Services, where basically you have a lot of private missions to the moon. And these are sort of risky ventures. They're sort of trying to figure out new ways to go to the moon to reduce costs. So, these are ventures in which you put these uncrewed payloads on the moon. Some of these might fail, and they're accepting a high failure rate. So that they can actually get some payloads there, and so that they can learn how to do this better and more cheaply in the future. And this itself is part of course, you have the American Artemis program, and the Americans want to return to the moon permanently. And the Chinese, as well as the Russians, have their own ILRS program. So you have these two sets of powers that are determined to really set up shop on the moon permanently. And you have a whole bunch of these uncrewed missions, right? And the concern is the moon going to turn into a junkyard? And also, when you have the moon's resources, how do you use them? And these are not actually new questions. They are actually as old as the space age. And there's actually like a whole series of laws that go back to the early 60s. And there's actually a whole series of laws that go back to the early 60s that deal with this issue of lunar governance. But what I'm really fascinated by is that if you ask people what is the first law that humans passed uh, regarding the moon, most people would say the Outer Space Treaty, which came out in 1967. Uh, but actually, the first law is actually the Partial Test Ban Treaty.
Yeah.
Right, because the Partial Test Ban Treaty is 1963 is essentially the law that says you can't. Basically, it prescribes all sorts of nuclear testing. So this is overground nuclear testing, as well as nuclear testing in outer space and nuclear testing on celestial bodies. So basically, it said if you're thinking about exploding a nuclear device on the moon, no, you can't. Now, we might think this is crazy, but there were actually proposals to do this, right? There was actually, for example, an American proposal of, let's go and detonate a nuclear weapon on the surface of the moon. It'll scare the Soviets. I don't know why the Soviets would be scared by the detonation of a nuclear weapon on the moon. But yes, it's possible that in an alternate future, one of the first things that humans did may have been to set off a hydrogen bomb on the moon. We can, I suppose, be thankful that didn't happen. Yeah, but yes, of course, After the partial test ban treaty, you get the outer space treaty. This is really sort of foundational space law. Outer space treaty is the basis of everything that we do in space today. It has almost universal acceptance, and every single country that's a spacefarer swears by the outer space treaty. And basically, what does the outer space treaty do? It has a whole series of principles that I think most of us would take for granted. So, firstly, basic things like, well, space is meant for exploration and use for all states. You can't have national appropriation. Article 2 of the outer space treaty says you can't have national appropriation in outer space, including the moon. Now, what national appropriation means is complicated. One thing that I think all countries agree on is you can't, for example, occupy a portion of the moon and say this is my country's sovereign territory, right? So that is clearly, that's a clear case of national appropriation. But if I were to say I am picking up this rock from the moon and now this belongs to my country, is that national appropriation?
Yeah.
That is where you have a lot of debate right now. And the rest of the OST in the Outer Space Treaty is about, astronauts being the envoys of mankind. You can't. It builds on the Partial Test Ban Treaty and says you can't place weapons of mass destruction, and it asks states to pass national legislation to oversee their own space activities and so on. So that's it's fairly standard stuff. And you had after that three treaties that sort of supplemented provisions that already existed in the Outer Space Treaty. You had the Rescue and Return Agreement, which basically meant sort of like in the law of the sea, you have to provide assistance to astronauts in trouble if you are able to do so. There's a liability convention. If you cause damage to another country's space assets, then your country is responsible for that. And you have the registration convention, which is basically please register your space objects. Countries follow this to differing degrees because, of course, among other things, you have spy satellites. But yeah, really the Partial Test Ban Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty are sort of they were products of their time, of the 1960s, when you had this rapidly expanding space activity with both the US and USSR launching these uncrewed satellites and also beginning to probe the moon. And it was also the product of early détente between the superpowers, because you had in 1962 the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they did understand that they had to come to some sort of arrangements to manage their rivalry. Now, I should also say that these treaties didn't also come out of the blue, in the sense that the OST was also it could build on some existing UN resolutions. There was the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which has provisions that are actually very similar to those of the Outer Space Treaty. So you could build on these precedences and create this new treaty. Now, this is basically what we call foundational space law, but what has happened since then is it's fragmented. And so after the Outer Space Treaty and its three supplementary treaties, you don't really have new agreements that have that sort of universal appeal. Now, emblematic of this is what we call the Moon Agreement or the Moon Treaty. This really started in negotiations, or discussions started in 1970, and this is right in the middle of the Apollo landings. Right, the Apollo landings start in 1969 and end in 1972, and so obviously there's this sense of urgency. We need to do something about this. The moment the Apollo landings end in 1972 with the Apollo 17 mission, and it's also clear that the Soviets don't have any immediate plans to put people on the moon, the sense of urgency just dissipates from the negotiations, right? And you start seeing the Soviets and the Americans start either dilly-dallying or at one point reversing their positions. Now, one of the provisions that the early drafts of the Moon Treaty had was this idea that the moon and other celestial bodies. Because while it's called the Moon Agreement, it's actually about all celestial bodies. It says that these are the common heritage of mankind. Now, what does that mean?
Yeah, everyone can draw their own conclusions.
Yes, exactly. Right now, where does this come from? Well, so there's a precedence because at the same time, there was another far more consequential treaty that was being negotiated at a multilateral level, which was the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UNCLOS treaty. Now, UNCLOS is one of the most important and far reaching treaties that have been negotiated in the last 100 years, right? And it's still very much in operation. For example, when we talk about what China is doing in the South China Sea, a lot of the time we're saying they're violating UNCLOS, right? Now, what was interesting is that UNCLOS came up with this idea. That's firstly said that any part of the seabed that is beyond the national jurisdiction of states, and in the eventual form that UNCLOS took, that meant beyond your exclusive economic zone. Now that happened much later in the 1980s, but basically, if it was beyond your national jurisdiction, it was the common heritage of mankind, which meant that you couldn't just go, for example, and mine the seabed. Which was obviously, a very environmentally destructive thing, and it ended up seeming like you were just appropriating the Earth's resources, even though they didn't belong to you. And it did not take long for that idea to be picked up and applied to the moon and other celestial bodies. Actually, makes a lot of sense. And there's also connected with this the idea of creating a new and fairer economic system for the developing countries. Now, basically, the late 60s, early 70s was a time of great pessimism about the economic prospects of these developing countries. Some of them had been decolonized, some were in the process of still of being decolonized. Even when they were decolonized, some of these countries were locked into these existing relationships with companies based in the West that extracted natural resources, often on unfavorable terms. So you had a bunch of developing countries that could not really compete on a lot of finished goods, value-added products, were often getting unfair deals on raw materials exports. And so the idea was, shouldn't we have a new economic system where we do, in some respects, favor the interests of these developing countries? When you have a trade deal, you don't insist on reciprocity between the two sides. So basically what that means is a developing country can keep some tariffs, but a developed country should open up its markets so that these countries can export. So this is what at that time came to be known as the New International Economic Order, NIEO. And the Moon Treaty's common heritage of mankind, and UNCLOS, which also finally incorporated this phrase, the common heritage of mankind, came into currency. Now, one country that was immediately opposed to this whole common heritage of mankind business was the Soviet Union. It was not the evil capitalist Americans. It was the wonderful communists, and because they also wanted to go and exploit the moon, and they did not want these developing countries to get in their way. So as negotiations dragged on, by 1979, 1980, 1979, negotiations got concluded. But what had happened by then was these positions flipped. The Soviets came around to the idea of common heritage of mankind. Part of the reason they did so was basically they got a concession that basically differentiated the phrase common heritage of mankind in the Moon Treaty from the way it applied in UNCLOS, in the UN Convention. So, this is all complete legal fictions, right? So they did that. Meanwhile, in America, you have this Reagan Revolution, which is just about to take off. Jimmy Carter is very unpopular, and you have Ronald Reagan coming to power. And you have by 1980, when the 1979 negotiations are concluded, 1980, Reagan's in power. And Reagan administration says, what is this common heritage of mankind stuff? You are getting in the way of American private enterprises and so on. What do these developing countries think they are? So you have these positions flipped. Meanwhile, the treaties opened up for signature. A handful of developing countries sign it, as well as Australia and France. Why they did so is quite interesting in themselves, but it again has to mostly do with their own domestic politics rather than anything else. The Soviets also lose interest. So not a single major spacefaring state at that time signed on to the Moon Treaty.
The Moon Treaty, yeah.
Right. One country that did sign on was India, but India did not ratify it.
Oh, so we have kept that door open.
Yes, potentially. So that's a situation with the Moon Treaty. It's something that never really came into never gained popularity.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
So we see, I mean, could you say that given at that point, like there were not many seafaring nations in the first place, and the spacefaring nations in the first place, and at the same time, the technology was not yet developed to exploit the moon or any special body or do drilling and all. And now we see that the things are changing. So, what kind of stresses do you think that the Moon Treaty is facing or is going to face? Like, is there a like can the Moon Treaty sustain this changed reality, or does it have enough leeway, or it is much better to to have a new deal, because the powers that be have also changed from 1980s to 2020s. So how do you think that plays out?
Yeah, interesting question. So, I mean, yeah, the short answer is the Moon Treaty is, of course, under a lot of pressure. And the most obvious source of pressure is actually the United States. In 2020, the US launched the Artemis Accords. Now, Artemis Accords are not law. We'll get into what they are. But, I mean, there's a bit of background to this. In 2015, the Americans passed a space law, a commercial space law, that also included a provision that allowed American companies to do mining on celestial bodies and asteroids. Now, immediately after that, not immediately after, and then later on, the Trump administration, basically, Trump passed an executive order that uh, asked the State Department to go and basically make this a norm in international affairs through bilateral, multilateral agreements or statements of any sort. And the result, of course, was the Artemis Accords, right? And the Artemis Accords initially had just 8 signatories. Now it's something like 33 signatories. India became a signatory to the Artemis Accords in June of 2022, when the Indian Prime Minister was on a visit to Washington.
Oh, I think it was last year. So
Yes, last year, June 23.
23, yeah.
Yeah. So, and the Artemis Accords, what are they? So the Artemis Accords are mostly, if you look at most of the provisions of the Artemis Accords, it's fairly short. It has these 10 provisions. Most of them are just like restating principles from the Outer Space Treaty. So that's, it's mostly uncontroversial. There are a handful of things that are potentially controversial. Now, one of these the one I find the most interesting is protecting heritage, right? So now, if you're American, you do want to protect your heritage on the moon. So you have, for example, the Apollo landing sites, which include Apollo 11, which is the first time humans landed on the moon. So that's potentially, and that's insignificant to everyone in the world. But so you say you want to protect it, so you don't want anybody else to come and do activity there. Now, does India's Chandrayaan-1 also qualify, for example, right? What about all those failed missions from the CLIPS, the CLPS program that I mentioned, right? So, you every now and then you have a rover going and crash landing on the moon. Are all of those also heritage sites?
So like each country can claim like this is where my craft landed or crashed or something. So this is my secret area.
Yes.
So now you have like 100 areas like that on the moon.
Yeah. So are there any real clear provisions or guidelines for what you can actually call heritage, right? So this is an obvious problem, and also once you declare it heritage, there's no time limit. In fact, it becomes potentially more significant over time, right? So something that's 1,000 years old is more typically considered more valuable than something that's 100 years old. So is there any end to this? So, I mean, it's in India, like in India, you have the Archaeological Survey of India has these protected monuments, and every other building is a protected monument in India. So that's a problem. The other two are, one is deconfliction. Now, again, deconfliction doesn't sound like a big deal because basically it's common good sense, right? You want to, it's really space traffic management. If I'm in an area, I don't want you to also come and operate, and if you're in another area, I shouldn't be coming there. The problem is, the Artemis Accords are very scrupulous in the way they cite the OST, the Outer Space Treaty, for this, right? So there's a provision in the Outer Space Treaty on avoiding what is called harmful interference. Now, the Outer Space Treaty is absolutely vague, so nobody knows exactly what harmful interference is, right? But okay, so they declare this, again, Artemis, to be fair to Artemis, it's quite reasonable about all this. It says, the size and scope of this safety zone, this deconfliction zone, must be based on actual activities you're undertaken. If that activity ends, you have to end that having that exclusion zone or deconfliction zone. And even if say your activity reduces, you must again reduce the size of that. So it's very clear about that. Also, it asks signatories to keep the UN Secretary General informed about all the activities that you're doing. If there's any changes in your activity, this is part of really, again, part of both the Outer Space Treaty as well as various discussions that have happened in the UN under what's called the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. So again, it's very much citing best practices that are around. The problem is that, again, there is no time limit, right? So I can say this, I'm continuing to do this activity here, and you continue to do that for next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. So essentially that kind of starts becoming like like your territory, and it sounds an awful lot like national appropriation, which is exactly the thing that the OST says you shouldn't do. Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. You do have a precedence in a sense for this with the Antarctic Treaty. Now, there are some countries that claim sovereignty there. Those are not claims are not recognized. But for example, if you go and set up a base in Antarctica, and you have that base for 20 or 30 or 40 years, yes, I mean, you're not really claiming that as your sovereign territory. But it becomes de facto your area.
Like if you want to move away from that base and want to have a new one, most likely you will have your own base there. Like you will not have some other country be like, okay, now your time is up, now it's my turn.
Exactly.
So it becomes, it's like, you have in property, like if you sit at one place for long enough, it becomes your property, not irrespective of whether it is somebody else's.
Absolutely. So, in international law and certainly in space law, possession is 9/10 of the law, right?
Yeah.
So if you go and hold it, so what's to stop anyone from, basically what's to stop you? And then I think the single most controversial provision of the Artemis Accords, the one I think that gets discussed most, is the use of space resources. Now, if you look at the Moon Treaty, the way you might interpret it is, well, you can't really use space resources for anything other than very, very limited scientific purposes, bring back small amount of, say, moon samples for study and so on, stuff like that. Even when you do that, you have to share those findings with other countries. You might also have to share some of those samples you brought with other countries so that they can do their own research on it and things like that. I'll tell you what the Artemis Accords actually says, since this has brought up so much controversy. So one is that space resource utilization can benefit humankind by providing critical support for safe and sustainable operations. Second, it says that extraction and utilization must comply with the Outer Space Treaty and must be in support of safe and sustainable activities. Third, it says that you have to keep the UN Secretary General informed, of course. And then finally, signatories will use the experience they've gained, to develop international best practices and rules and so on. Now, again, this sounds very reasonable for most part. And I think it's important and very significant that the Artemis Accords say that the reason you use space resources is to support safe and sustainable activities in space. Now, Artemis Accords are very much connected to the Artemis program, which is America's plan to return to the moon permanently. And their idea is, look, realistically, if you go to the moon, you are going to have to use some lunar resources, right? If you go to Antarctica, you do pick up that lunar ice and melt it and drink water with it. You use that for drinking water, right? Now, you have lunar ice. We know that there is lunar ice, especially in the lunar South Pole, but also the North Pole. And so that is actually very useful for sustaining human presence on the moon. Obviously, water can provide a drinking water and then water for other uses, and you can get oxygen from it, right?
I mean, that, and I mean, even if you want to have a presence, for example, the raw materials that you would want, I mean, it would be kind of unwise to expect to have to ship cargo of building materials. So now there's so much research going on how to build materials with lunar soil or
right, the regolith.
Regolith. So all of that means that you can't escape not using the resource.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So, I mean, the two resources that are realistically thought about for use in the moon are A, water ice, and two, regolith, which is the lunar soil. So, what we mean by that is, for example, if you want to create a lunar habitat, ultimately you are going to have to dig up some of the regolith. At the very least, you want to bury your lunar habitation under regolith, because it provides an additional layer of protection from radiation as well as temperature variations that exist on the moon. And then, like you said, there are all sorts of experiments. Lots of startups are working on processing regolith, baking it or using lasers to shape it, basically into creating construction material. Right now, if these things work out, the case that people who support the Artemis Accords are saying is it's insane not to do that, right? And what is the harm? Like, we are using this only in situ. This is really what's called in situ resource utilization. We're using it on the site to support safe and sustainable operations in space. Now, of course, there are some problems with this, as there are with all of these things. Right now, the moment you start, so the moon is a low gravity, zero atmosphere environment, and for example, we learned recently that even Chandrayaan 3 basically kicked up tons of lunar dust, right? And the reason that happens is because there's nothing to stop that dust from flying off, right? There's no atmosphere, no friction, and very low gravity. The moment you start doing anything with lunar regolith, you're going to create these massive dust clouds. If those dust clouds interfere with other space operations, uncrewed probes, or even other human habitation, that's harmful interference under the Outer Space Treaty.
And
right?
You can't stop it. You can't be like, okay, this is my land, so the lunar storm here is only for me. If there's a probe from China like that next to you,
yes,
you can't be like, you're exempted from that.
Yeah, you can't say no, not my problem. Now it gets more complicated because it's not necessarily like everybody's, like, you're going to be evenly distributed across the moon, because it looks like there are some attractive bits of real estate which are mostly along the poles. And the reason is simply that like, for example, in the lunar south pole, you have the permanently shadowed regions where the sun hasn't really, because basically they're in craters, so sun hasn't reached for billions of years, and that's where you have trapped lunar water ice. Otherwise it would have melted off and vaporized. And then you have these higher peaks where, because it's a polar region, there's always some sun, right? So that's a great place to park your solar cells, right? So you have these very specific parts of the moon that are potentially valuable real estate. And if you go there and even start using regolith, just for example, manipulate just a little regolith to build your lunar base, you can create dust clouds. Those dust clouds can interfere with the space activities of other countries. Those dust clouds could cause degradation. You could have dust clouds going and polluting the water ice in the permanently shadowed
regions. Even the fact that because it's a very prime real estate, as we said, if you do experiments there, then now it is essentially your land. So if it's very restricted and very like precious, the ones who go there for the first two, 3 countries to go would essentially own that piece of prime real estate, and everybody else can just like be on the bright side of the moon and like be okay with no water. But the ones who are on the dark side can be more happy with more water, more access, and also data, right? I think so. Yeah, this is it is quite fascinating. I mean, the fact that we don't think about these things like, okay, yeah, it's the property of of humankind, but what does that actually mean? Which humankind, which country goes and places the flag and says, like, this is the mankind that we're talking about.
So I mean, so this isn't necessarily like far side and bright side of the moon. It's just the polar regions. But yeah, I will just, before we wrap up, just say that there are two things. You talked about all mankind. The Outer Space Treaty calls space the province of all mankind, whereas the Moon Treaty calls it common heritage of mankind. And these are two very different concepts.
You can pick and choose, right? Like what your interest like accounts for. Absolutely. You're like, okay, yeah, I believe in that one. But it is quite fascinating. I mean, as we see that all these conflicts will only become like much more prominent as the technology matures, as we see private sector now going, like, becoming increasingly more important in space industry.
Yeah.
And once the private industry also comes in a big way, the all about common heritage and common mankind and all of that, it would take a backseat, because at that point it would be the private interest or just the interest of businesses, which is not bad, but it changes the equation. When you have no stake and when you have actual stake, that is quite different. So it was great having you, Aditya. I look forward to having you again when we supposedly are going to have an Indian go to the International Space Station, like in a few months, hopefully. That goes well. So looking forward to talking to you about that.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Saurabh.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.